So now this is the video lecture for chapter 14, which is the invention of opera. As I mentioned in class Friday, the invention of opera more or less coincides with the beginning of the Baroque era. The Baroque era is usually said to last from 1600 to 1750. The first opera ever written was written in the year 1600, first modern opera, and 1750 is the death of J.S. Bach, so that's very convenient to bookend the Baroque era from 1600 to 1750. So, we start with the development of opera. The forerunners of opera, well, opera is from the Italian word for work, same Latin root as the word opus. Opus, if you've ever seen a piece of music that says opus 1, that literally means first work, first piece of music. It's generally defined as a combination of versified play. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's a play set in verses. The term for this is the libretto. Libretto is literally the written word that is used that the composer then sets to music. So a librettist will write a libretto, sometimes adapted from another source, say Shakespeare or another author. They will write a libretto, which is going to be the words that the composer will then set to music. Singing is almost continuous. Generally speaking, opera does not have any spoken dialogue, although there are a couple of exceptions in some of the comic operas styles that have some spoken dialogue. It's staged, it has scenery, it has costumes, it has action, it has dancing, sometimes there's sword fighting or other kinds of violence engaged in. So opera can get extremely involved. Some people feel that opera is the greatest of all art forms because it combines instrumental music in the pit orchestra, vocal music with the singers, visual arts with the scenery, costumes, dancing, the written word with the libretto. So it's really a fusion of all other art forms. Of course, who did they use as a model? They used the Greeks. They, a group of scholars who called themselves the Florentine Camerata got together and they talked about art and science and other things. And they decided they wanted to revive Greek drama. So they looked at all these great Greek tragedies by authors such as Sophocles and try and revive Greek drama. They had this idea that Greek dramas were actually kind of spoken and sung, and that's what they wanted to create with this opera. One of the members of the Florentine Camerata, Girolamo Mai, he believed that all of the text in these Greek dramas was sung and that it consisted of a single melody sung by a soloist or the chorus, and it could be accompanied by instruments but didn't have to be. So, as I just said, the Florentine Camerata, a group of scholars in Florence who used to meet, discuss literature, science, the arts, and they kind of decided they were going to try and revive these Greek dramas in what they considered to be a modern opera. Another member of the Florentine Camerata, Vincenzo Galilei, he wrote a book translated as Dialogue of Ancient and Modern Music. In this book, he felt that counterpoint, the kind of complex counterpoint that was happening in the late Renaissance, specifically in the madrigals, he thought that was not good, that was not proper music, and that the solo song, the solo melody sung, is the perfect vehicle for emotional expression. That's what he argued in this particular book. You can certainly see how this helped give rise to this idea of modern opera. The term that they used for this is monody, M-O-N-O-D-Y. Monody is a accompanied solo vocal text. So that takes us to, there were forerunners to this, but what is generally considered to be the first opera in any kind of modern form is Eurydice, which was written in 1600. The music was by a gentleman named Jacopo Peri. The libretto, the book that Peri set to music, was by Rinuccini, and it was directed by a well-known actor of time, Cavallari. It was produced they staged this performance for the wedding of Maria de Medici and King Henry IV. The de Medici family was the most powerful family in all of Italy. Very, very powerful, very wealthy, very politically connected. Many of them were political leaders in Italy. So when Maria de Medici was marrying King Henry IV, this was the ultimate power marriage happening. So they wrote and performed this opera, Eurydice. Now, Eurydice is originally a Greek tragedy. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus, the son of Apollo, is the world's greatest musician. Eurydice is his wife. She eats poison pomegranate or something like that, and she dies, and she is taken down into the underworld. It's a Greek tragedy. They didn't really have the modern Christian concept of heaven and hell. She was taken down into the underworld by Hades. Orpheus, who is the world's greatest musician, is determined that he is going to go to the underworld and bring her back to the surface. So he goes down into the underworld. This is a story that's been set in opera on multiple occasions, the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. And he sings for the king of hell, if you will, king of the underworld. And he is so impressed and so moved by Orpheus' singing that he says, okay, you can take Eurydice and you can go back to the surface. But you have to trust me. Just walk on out of here and don't ever look back. If you look back, the deal's off. Very story similar to the Old Testament story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Lot's wife looks back at the city and she's turned to a pillar of salt. In this case, Eurydice looks back and she vanishes from Orpheus' side to go back to the underworld. Of course, Orpheus is heartbroken, but the gods take pity on Orpheus and they raise Eurydice into the heavens as a star so that Orpheus can view her every night. This is the Greek tragedy of Orpheus and Eurydice. It was set to music. The tragedy was adapted, libretto, and set to music by Paris. This is considered to be the first opera. However, I've already gone through all of this, of course. Orpheus going down into the underworld. Musically, it's used to show how expressive music can be, how it can move the emotions. Now, Paris invented a new kind of musical style here, which later became known as the recitative. A recitative is essentially speaking on pitch and in rhythm. It's kind of vocally singing, but rhythmically speech, if you will. Some of the members of the Florentine Camerata believe that this was the style that the Greeks actually used for their tragedies, this kind of spoken speech song, or rhythmic singing, if you will. The way it's accompanied in this opera is there's basso continuo, which holds sustained chords while the singer, either Orpheus or Eurydice, sings their melody, so you get dissonances and then resolutions all happening against these sustained chords. Now, this leads us to Monteverdi. We talked about Monteverdi in class on Friday as far as his idea of the second practice, where dissonances did not have to be prepared following the rules of 15th century counterpoint. Monteverdi, in 1607, composed what is considered to be the first great opera, the first large-scale opera that really took advantage of all of these different things. And this was titled Orfeo, same story. 7 years later, Monteverdi takes the story of Orpheus and Eurydice that Jacopo Paris set, and he sets the exact same story. Eurydice dying, going down into the underworld, Orpheus going down there singing for the people in the underworld, for the creatures in the underworld, and they allow Eurydice to go back with him. So subject matter is the same. He organized it, he structured it as a 5-act opera. It's still short, each act is pretty short, and each act is centered around a song, an aria sung by Orfeo, and then a chorus which comments on the situation. If you're familiar with Greek drama, there's a thing called the Greek chorus. The Greek chorus was not part of the action. Their job was to stand downstage and comment on the action. They were kind of the narrators, as it were. So Monteverdi uses the chorus in this opera as almost the same kind of function. Very famous picture of Monteverdi. Remember this, we're going to watch a video. See what he's wearing, the black robe with the starched white collars and the beard. Very, very standard look for the day. Now, some other things Monteverdi did in this score, he actually specified the instruments, recorders, cornets, cornetos, which are the wooden instruments. They have finger holes like a flute, but it has a cupped mouthpiece like a trumpet. It's kind of the forerunner of a trumpet, but also trumpets, natural trumpets that could just play fanfare type things. Trombones, string instruments, and continuo. In this, he uses a couple of different styles of monody. Remember, monody means an accompanied solo voice. He writes arias. An aria is basically just sung over top of an accompaniment. The arias are strophic. However, each strophe is of a slightly different length and style because of the variations within the text. He also uses recitatives, which we just talked about, kind of that speech song over top of a continuo. We will listen to Orfeo's Lament. This is one of the very famous arias from an early opera, still sung today. We will listen to this in class. Monteverdi wrote 12 operas that we know of. Now, this is interesting to me. He wrote 12 operas, but we only actually have the music for 3 of those operas. 9 of them, the music is gone. Maybe he wrote the music, copied the music out, they performed it at the premiere, and then who knows what happened to the music. Maybe the opera was not successful, so the music was recycled. You know, he flipped it over and wrote on the back of it. Maybe it was cold one night and he used it to start the fire. Maybe it was destroyed in a flood or an accident. You know, we don't know necessarily what happened to the music for the 9 other operas. So we only have music for 3 of his operas. How do we know that he wrote 12? Well, letters and ledger accounts. You know, as we look through history, we might see a record, a bank record saying, for example, Handel paid X number of musicians on this date for performance of this work, so we know that he composed and performed that work, even if we don't necessarily have the music. So we know that Monteverdi wrote 12 operas, only 3 of them survive to this day. Probably the greatest of these operas was composed in 1643, The Coronation of Poppaea. That is based on Roman history. It's not based on Greek tragedy. Now, I want to emphasize here, these first 2 operas we talked about are both based on the same Greek tragedy. Greek tragedy was far and away the favorite subject of opera composers for a few reasons. I mean, first, they were attempting to revive this Greek tragedy style. Secondly, these operas were usually commissioned by and performed for the extremely wealthy. By resurrecting these Greek heroes, it gave the composer, and certainly the people at the other people attending the opera, the opportunity to flatter the wealthy person by drawing comparisons to, oh, you're as wise as Zeus, or you must be as strong as Hercules, or whatever. It was just an opportunity to brown-nose the extremely wealthy. So most early operas were based in Greek myths, Greek tragedies. However, the Coronation of Poppaea was actually based on a historical fact of the Roman Emperor Nero, his second marriage. A lot of people consider this to be his greatest opera, although it's not his most historically significant opera. His most historically significant opera is, as I said, Orfeo. So, opera spread. Opera moved to Rome. Rome became the main place in the 1620s where opera composers were experimenting and trying to expand opera. They explored more topics other than just Greek mythology. They used all of the technology available to them at the time to make the effects on stage as amazing as they could. We think, of course, of modern special effects in movies. Obviously, the stage effects at the time were extremely crude by today's standards, almost laughable, like a third-grade play compared to today's standards. But at the time, it was like no one had ever seen before. It really blew people's minds. The recitative and the aria became more separated in their style. recitatives becoming more like speech, and the arias becoming more melodious, more based in melody. Also, what would happen in Rome is the idea of the castrato. Now, castrati, castrato is singular, castrati is plural, were men who had been castrated before they reached puberty. Now, castrated means essentially that your testicles are surgically removed. Because of this, they enter puberty and they grow up to be men, but their voice never changes. So they are male sopranos, males who still sing in the same range as a boy soprano. Why? Well, there's still this tradition of women. Women were not allowed to sing in church, and in Rome, women were not allowed to appear on the opera stage, so castrati sang all of the treble parts, both in Italian churches and on stage. Eventually, castrati became popular in other countries, never as popular as they were in Italy, although in other countries they didn't sing female roles. They generally only sang male roles, but male roles written to be sung in the soprano register. Obviously, this has gone out of style. It went out of style before the end of the Baroque era, and there are no active castrati today so far as I know of. Now, Rome became the centerpiece of operatic innovation, but Venice was still the heartbeat of opera. In 1637, the first public opera house opened, as I said in class on Friday. This was the first opera house where anybody could go and pay the admission fee, buy a ticket, and go in and watch an opera. Remember, Eurydice was written to be performed at the wedding of King Henry IV and Maria de' Medici. Opera was only available to the extremely wealthy, who could hire the musicians and pay for the sets and all of that. But 1637, someone opened a public opera house thinking this is going to be popular. Well, they were right. By just 45 years later, 9 different public opera houses were opened in Venice. Venetian opera actually became a huge tourist attraction. People would come from all over Europe to see opera in Italy. The recitative and aria became even more delineated and clearly separated from each other. And then eventually, by this time, singers became popular, and singers would command very high fees. The most famous singers would get paid the most, including castrati. Some castrati became extremely wealthy, and they would even have works written specifically with them in mind. It's just a drawing. You probably can't really see this well on the PowerPoint at all, of the Teatro Grimani in Venice, where here's the stage, and even in those days, the common folk with the cheap tickets sat on the floor. The boxes were reserved for the wealthy, so they could stay apart from the common folk. It became a real sign of your wealth and your importance if you stayed apart from the common folk. So, Italian opera, of course, spread. It became very popular in Italy, so it makes sense that people would try and import it in other places. We know that by the 1640s, they were performing Italian operas in Paris. So far as we know, they did not perform Italian operas in England during this time. Italian opera did not move to England until after 1700. Austria, however, outside of Germany, became a major center for Italian opera. So originally, Italian composers and Italian performers went on tour, if you will. They relocated to another city. Eventually, composers in those countries began composing Italian opera. So initially, opera, that you think of the ideas of the Florentine Camerata, they wanted to revive the Greek tragedies. They thought the story was the most important thing, and they wanted to use opera as a vehicle to tell these stories. But eventually, didn't take too long, people wanted to pay more money to hear the famous singers and to see these fancy stage effects. So the idea of the solo singing and the effects overcame the fundamental part of just telling the story. To this day, this is a push-pull thing. If you just look at movies today, what movies sell the most tickets? It's movies like Star Wars with lots of special effects that you can have a lot of fun watching. What movies win the Academy Awards? That's usually lower budget art films that are all about the story, the emotion, the actor's portrayal of sympathetic figures. They win the Oscars, they win the critics, but movies with lots of special effects and famous people, well, they sell the most tickets. This is a tension that's been going on as long as there's been staged performances of anything. If you go back to Shakespeare, there was probably push and pull between, okay, what's more important, the story or the selling of the story, as it were. Okay, that is the end of chapter 14, PowerPoint. On Monday in class, we are going to, first we're going to listen to the Monteverdi Madrigal that we talked about today in class. We'll look at that score, and then we're going to spend a little time looking at Eurydice by Jacopo Puri, and a lot more time looking at Orfeo by Claudio